Welcome back, listeners. It's a pleasure to have you join us here today on the season finale of Learning from Friends Season 1. This is the special Halloween episode here for all those lovely listeners that stuck it out with us thus far. And I want to thank, before we fully get into things here, Ryan Cherry for giving us this lovely introduction of music, intro music, and outro music that you'll hear at the end of the episode. So that is a awesome, cool addition to it. And on Season 2, that begins tomorrow, on November 1st, you will hear the very new theme song that's being added in. Also, which will be coming from Ryan Cherry. So thank you, Ryan. You've been on the podcast earlier, and you've always been a blessed help throughout the school year. We work at the same school. We have kind of stuff going on in the same area, and it's nice to have that contribution in here. So welcome back, listeners. As you all know, my name is Cade Curtis, your tour guide on this adventure that we call Learning from Friends. And to start off every single episode that we do, a quote from my mother. And this one comes from Mark and Angel. They have a nice little blog that they do inspirational quotes and stuff out there. So here we go. Note to self. Happiness is letting go of what you assume your life is supposed to be like right now and sincerely appreciating it for everything that it is. So relax. You're enough. You have enough. You do enough. Breathe deep. Let it go. And live right now in the moment. I love these little quotes, Mom. Thank you for sending these to me. It starts my day off nicely. I have a little whiteboard in my classroom that I write these on the board to from time to time as well, for any kid that enters in my classroom can be able to see that. So also for any listeners that are my students, past or current, thank you for being a student. And those that are in there right now, make sure you're doing your homework and studying for your test. Just be prepared. So for today's episode, this is a special, as I said earlier, Halloween edition for Learning from Friends. And the guest that I had, I was so excited when he agreed to come on and talk here because it fits the bill perfectly. My friend Dakota and I have known each other for about 18 years now. A lot of my guests that come on are known for a long time. That's the whole point of Learning from Friends here. My friend Dakota is, out of all my friends, I was like, I have to have him come on for a Halloween episode. And he is so entrenched and loves the horror films out there. And as a result of that, I go, your knowledge, your figurines, your endless conversations that we've had about this stuff, would you come on and do this? And he goes, yeah, I'd do it. At first, we agreed on doing a Friday the 13th episode. But I was like, I do Mondays. So we agreed that luckily Halloween fell on a Monday this year. So Dakota, welcome to the special Halloween episode of Learning from Friends 2022.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
I'm really looking forward to seeing what I learned from you today.
Our listeners are going to get the true gift here from all of that. Can you paint us a visual picture here of audio technology of who is Dakota? Because 99% of people that are listening to this have no clue who you are.
Sure. Well, I'm a big music fan. I love rock and roll. Kiss and Van Halen are my two favorite bands, but I also love other kinds of music, pop music, grunge, alternative, a little bit of country even. I'm a huge animal lover. I've got two dogs at home, Faye and Zoe, that I've had since 2009, both adopted, both rescues, that I absolutely love to death, and they're still very happy and healthy. I'm an alumni of Kennesaw State University and the University of Georgia. Professionally, I work as a pharmacist, and also I love watching movies and TV series, and I love action, I love sci-fi, I love comedies, and of course, as everyone knows, I love horror.
That is definitely your cup of tea, and today you're actually wearing a Halloween t-shirt.
Well, of course, dress for the occasion, right?
Always dress for the occasion. So we've known each other for about 18 years. Do you have any funny stories that you would like to say out there to embarrass me in front of the podcast listeners?
Yeah, the first story that pops into my mind that's kind of a funny story as well is when you and I went to theaters to see a non-horror movie called Gran Torino.
Oh, yes. Oh, my gosh.
You remember this?
Oh, I do remember this.
So we went to the theater, and that screening was packed. It may have been sold out even by the time the film started. And you had bought 5, 6 tickets. Like, you had a whole crowd of people that were all coming to the film. And I think because of how well it was selling, you bought the tickets up front before most of your friends had arrived for the screening. So you were out front trying to like wrangle everybody as they park their cars and distribute tickets and all that good stuff. And you sent me into the auditorium before the movie started with the task of trying to hold 5 or 6 seats in this theater that was very crowded and very busy. So I'm sitting there and I'm nervous and I'm doing my best trying to stretch out an arm or put out a flannel shirt or something to reserve a chair. But that only goes so far. And at some point, as people were continuing to file in and you were nowhere to be found, I had to slowly start allowing seats to go. So, okay, I lose the first seat, but all right, I still maybe have 4 out of 5. That's pretty good, right? And then I'm getting down to like 3, and then I'm even getting down to 2. And again, it's like you can only hold them for so long before one of those ushers of the theater is going to come up and flex their muscles and tell you, no saving seats. So anyway, finally I'm down to the final 2 seats, and I still have no idea where you're at or when you're coming. And I saw a different friend, one who was not there to see the movie with us, walk into the auditorium with his girlfriend. And I thought, gosh, I could wave them over and let them sit with me, and at least I'm watching the movie with someone I know, or I could still try and hold these last 2 seats for cade plus 1. So I decided, okay, let me wave over the person who showed up randomly. And so he came over, him and his girlfriend. We sat and watched the movie. The movie was fantastic. I never knew when you came in the auditorium. It was certainly after the lights had darkened and the previews had started or whatnot. And I also had a really poor cell phone signal in this auditorium. So I really couldn't communicate with you to say, hey, where are you? Or if you were texting me, I couldn't receive them. So the movie ended and it was emotional. Like I was crying by the end, and I walked out of the auditorium with all kinds of feelings, and I take my phone out and I have this text from you that one word, maybe 2. It's like weak or weak man. You said something like that.
Yeah.
And it popped up on my phone after the film had concluded. So I thought you were telling me that you thought the movie was weak because I had been one of the chief people that selected seeing this movie. And in my emotional state, I don't recommend this at home, but I responded to your criticism of the film. I responded to you and said, F you. Well, you came out of the auditorium having received my text, and you had this look of fire in your eyes as you walked up to me. Like, if you were the fighting type, I would have needed to duck because you would have taken a swing. And you came up to me and you're like, you didn't like the movie? And I'm like, what are you talking about? You're the one who didn't like the movie. You just texted me and said weak. And you said, no, I texted that before the movie started about your inabilities to keep the seats reserved. And I was like, oh, I had a really poor signal in there. And I just got the text after the movie. I was like, oops, sorry about that.
Yeah. What's ironic about this is we literally just yesterday did a lesson on misinterpretation of texting. So how ironic see of that story being brought up here. Yeah, my funny memory, I'm going to jump us back to high school here, of a Spanish class. You probably know where this is going. We had a substitute teacher that came in.
Yes.
We had a substitute teacher that came in and took over the class after our Spanish teacher. I'm not sure if she quit or retired. She probably quit because of our class was a little chaotic of all the classes that she had that year. But the sub could not pronounce names properly because she was a very heavy Spanish speaker herself, which was great, but it just didn't work out for us and came to name as Cacarecudis. So I'm like, okay, that's me. And then Takura Maui. So she had your first name right, but she just always hit stuck of Kudis and Maui. So that's one of my little funny memories. And then we were playing Battle of Bands at the Masquerade in Atlanta. And we're in the middle of like doing awards and doing all this stuff. And you had been there all day. You were a trooper. You came down with us. And we played early in the day, and then had to wait like 6 more hours before they did announcements. And there was a band playing. The final band was playing. I look over. You've got a chair, and you're sitting in the like almost on the fringe of where people were standing for the concert and stuff. And you're out cold. You're just laying there out in the chair, just sprawled back asleep. So I have to go over and wake you up whenever they do awards. Those are some good fond memories. Do you want to add one more, or are you ready to kind of rock and roll?
Let's rock and roll.
Sweet. So we're going to talk about horror films today. And this is an area that I'm not good at. Horror films never really draw me in too much because I don't do well with suspense. I don't do well with like gore unless it's comedy gore where it's just like so over the top ridiculous, like 1960s and 50s where it's like you put your hand in and it's like noodles that come up and that's supposed to be brains. I thought those were hilarious. But what is the like what's an origin story, like a history of horror films?
Yeah, I really can blame my older cousin, quite honestly. It was the autumn of 1996. I was a few months away from turning 7 years old, and my cousin, who's about 3 years older than me, he said to my mom one evening, "Hey, I think Dak's old enough to see his first horror movie." And now she was a preteen and a teenager in the 80s when horror and slashers specifically were having a real renaissance, and everyone was trying to outdo the previous movies that had come, and there was escalation of gore and nudity and the ways that victims on screen would get killed and all this stuff. So she was a little hesitant and was like, "Whoa, wait a minute. What are you wanting to show him?" And my cousin says, "How about Halloween? John Carpenter's Halloween from 1978. And so she thought, yeah, actually, that one's pretty mild. Most of the violence in the film is either implied or the knife goes forward and there's absolutely no gore or blood whatsoever accompanying the slash. And there's virtually no nudity in the film. A couple of quick booby flashes, but honestly, James Cameron's Titanic has more nudity in it than Halloween.
This is true.
And not much in the way of foul language. I'm not even sure if anybody says the F word one time in the movie. So in the grand scheme of horror and slashers, it's a pretty mild one. And she said, yeah, you can show him that if you want. So we went into his bedroom and little square television, VHS copy. He pops the movie in and I'm sitting there, and it was like a transformative experience over the next 90 minutes as I absorbed my first horror movie. And I loved it. And it just began from there. So much so that when the movie ended, my cousin looks to me and he says, "Hey, what'd you think of that? Did you enjoy it?" And I was like, "Yeah, that was amazing. Wow. I've never seen anything like that before. That's cool." And he's like, "Well, if you like that, then we should watch Halloween 2. There's a sequel and it takes place on the same night as this movie we just watched." And I was like, "What?
Continuation.
You're kidding." So I was like, "Yeah, let's go for it." So we were about 20 or 30 minutes into Halloween 2 when my mom came to tell me that she was ready to go home. And so she wanted to know, "Hey, do you want to stay and finish the movie? And I'll come back and get you tomorrow, or they'll bring you home, or do you want to come home with me now?" And this might seem like an easy question to answer, but unfortunately, my cousin and my aunt and my uncle, they kind of lived in a bit of an older, rundown trailer. You know, it wasn't the nicest place in the world. And so usually I preferred to go back home to my much cleaner apartment that I lived in with my mom and sleep in my own bed and all that good stuff. But on this night, I was having such a fascination with horror and the Halloween movies that I was like, "No, I'll stay." Like,
There you go.
Didn't even have to think about it. Yeah, I'll deal with the filth and stay here overnight. I got to see how this Halloween night ends in Halloween 2. And that's where it began for me.
That's amazing that one film can just change your life entirely. Now, there's horror films and there's all these subgenres. What defines a horror film?
I think a horror film can be anything that scares you or is unsettling, anything that can induce a little bit of fear or terror in you, anxiety. The horror genre in general, in my opinion, is a really big tent, though. There's all kinds of different types of movies that fit under that horror umbrella.
And we're going to hit on a lot of it being the slasher films, because that's what you really enjoyed. What makes the subgenre of slasher films?
So certainly in a slasher film, you have a central antagonist who is on the prowl, looking and dispatching would-be victims. You've got a group of characters, typically teenagers or young adults, that are about to cross paths with this villain. And one by one, the villain is usually stalking the characters and coming up with different ways to kind of kill them without their knowledge that their friends are being murdered.
Yeah, love the without your knowledge. And sometimes that pops up of how sometimes makes the cheesy part of it. Like, how do you not recognize this is happening? Or I know a lot of people yell at the film screen for those because it kind of feels that there's the model that's out there. And sometimes it feels like the people that are in the films are not always the most intelligent of individuals when making these decisions. But most of the time they are, but the cheesy ones, that's why sometimes I find it hilarious watching some of the cheesy ones. But it is a very enjoyable sequence to think, wow, if I was in this mindset, how would I respond to these situations? If I was there, would I survive? Would I not die? I know you would survive because you would think ahead of it. I'd be probably the first one dead, really going into it. But what is some history behind slasher films itself? Because I know horror had been around for a long time, and what kind of started this subgenre of slasher.
There's some elements present in films really kind of from the beginning, but when the slasher formula really started to get a little more refined and taking off, the genesis can really be traced to an early 70s slasher called Black Christmas, directed by Bob Clark. And this was one of the first films that really combined the elements of showing the camera doing a first-person point of view from the killer's perspective for different shots in the film, introducing having a group of young kids who were being stalked and killed one by one in different and creative manners. And from there, it was still a little slow to take off, I think, the slasher thing, but you had elements that popped up in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Again, you had elements in the late 70s that popped up in John Carpenter's Halloween, and really the success of Halloween, which for the longest time, it was the most successful independent film ever released, really led to Friday the 13th and the 1980s, where now Hollywood recognized that, hey, there's a formula here that makes money. We can make these movies pretty cheap, and we can center them around a holiday potentially and, market it based upon that. And so that's really, the 80s is really where slasher films took off based on that work that Halloween and Black Christmas had done in the 70s.
So we have 70s kind of starts out, the big major portion for slasher films. How far back is the origin story for horror films? Do you know that one by chance?
Actually, I have read up on it before because I was curious, and I don't remember the name, but if you look into the history of horror, as early as the earliest days of silent films, there were horror movies that had been made.
So like Nosferatu, does that fall underneath that kind of realm maybe?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I love Nosferatu. That's kind of cool to think that goes that far back. Now there was, silent films, that whole era was very much like an open wild, wild west of what would work, what wouldn't work. And it was expensive to make it, but then as technology became more and more available to people, you got all these different types that pop up there. And that's pretty cool to think that that's out there. Alfred Hitchcock, does that fall underneath horror films for some of his?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I definitely enjoyed a lot of his films over the years, and that's where some of the cheesiness comes out, in my opinion. But he could tell an amazing story. That's just one of those ones I definitely feel like that genre can kind of fit into. So that gives us a little bit of an origin story, but what are some foundational people that are for the horror films, like actors or maybe directors that really kind of help push for the slasher film movements?
So directors, Alfred Hitchcock would certainly be one of the ones that should be credited. There's elements present in Psycho that were later utilized and taken into future slasher films. Things like the villain's face kind of being obscured in shadow for the bulk of the film. I think the effective use of the score, the music in Psycho being another element. Again, Bob Clark, the director of Black Christmas. Funny story that some of your listeners may know is Bob Clark went on to direct another Christmas movie. Do you know what that was?
What would that be? I don't know.
A Christmas Story.
He went on to do a Christmas Story?
So
that's the director.
So
that's
Bob
hilarious.
Clark does the horror version of Christmas with Black Christmas and then comes back a decade later. I guess he was atoning for his sins, and he did the TBS 24-hour holiday classic, A Christmas Story.
That is amazing.
John Carpenter, again, gets the kudos for his early work in the horror genre with not only Halloween, but he had a made-for-TV film called Someone's Watching Me that he did at the same time. He also went on to do The Fog and some other horror movies in the 80s. You've got folks like Wes Craven, Tobe Hooper, Sean Cunningham. These are all those early directors in the 70s and the 80s that were influential to the style of horror and specifically of slashers. In terms of actors, certainly Jamie Lee Curtis has to be mentioned as possibly the original Scream Queen, or at least of our current generation. She was in so many horror movies there at the beginning of her career with Halloween, The Fog, Prom Night, Terror Train, Halloween 2. And now she's come back to horror again. She's playing the character that started it all, Laurie Strode. She's back playing her in a modern-day Halloween trilogy, so that's really cool. And then some other notable actors that have been involved in horror. Another actress named Danielle Harris has been a Scream Queen throughout her career. She was in a couple of Halloween movies as a young child herself, and then as an adult returned to the series for 2 additional films. She's also been in the Hatchet films, and she's been in See No Evil 2 and various horror movies herself. There's an actor named Tom Atkins who has been in numerous horror films, certainly back in the 80s as well. So many people made quite the career out of working in horror, or certainly in returning to horror throughout their careers.
And what's quite ironic is a lot of these individuals like Jamie Lee Curtis would transfer her career over into so many different genres. And I think a lot of people within horror are able to make that step as well. So that's cool to get their first introduction and then be able to find where they go. And then come back like Jamie Lee Curtis coming back into the genre after nearly, what was it, a decade or two before she came back into doing the horror film scene again.
Yeah, I mean, I think the gap between her early 80s work, the first time she returned to horror after that was at least 16 years later. In the late 90s, she returned to play Laurie Strode for the first time afterwards. And now her re-return that began in 2018 was another 15 years since the previous horror film that she had done.
Which is pretty amazing to think that you're still loved and remembered when you walk back in because of the foundation that she labeled in the beginning. Are there some other like gold standard directors and actors that they could be modern day, that they're being brought in a lot, or they could be older individuals that really people look forward to or look up to whenever there's a new film being released out, or, hey, I want you to be a co-director, or, hey, I want to help me write my new film?
I think right now Jordan Peele is doing a really good job of building his name up as a brand that sells horror movies. He's done Get Out and Us, and then recently released his third film, Nope. And like I say, I think he's succeeded in almost where his name is kind of like an event beyond the confines of what you might see in the trailer. Just the fact that he's involved in it is something that will get people excited. Kind of similar to how M. Night Shyamalan used to be really a name back in the late 90s and early 2000s that would get folks excited, that made it feel almost like an event. It made it feel bigger than just simply seeing a movie, when these folks were involved with the project. Other people, in terms of like actors or actresses, there's an actress named Jenna Ortega, who I think is kind of building a resume currently as a bit of a scream queen. So she's been in the most recent Scream movie, which was the fifth Scream movie, but it's called Scream, not to be confused with the 1996 movie that's called Scream. And she's also been in some other horror movies like X. And then she's going to be in the upcoming reboot called Wednesday, which is a reboot of the Addams Family franchise.
I'm curious.
She's playing Wednesday Addams. Yeah, I'm curious too. I mean, I'm really excited. It's executive produced, and I think all the episodes are directed by Tim Burton, so I'm very excited about that. Baby. I'm a big Tim Burton fan. He's another director who it's kind of an event when his name gets attached to a new project. So I'm really excited to see what he does with Wednesday.
Yeah, that'll be a good direction to see. What's that? Is that going to be HBO Max, or what's that going to be on?
Netflix.
Yeah, I can watch that then.
Are they one of our sponsors?
I wish they were. I wish we can get some sponsors over here, but I do have a Patreon page that you can go to. I'm going to make a little plug here. Learning from Friends. You can look it up on Patreon and make a donation.
Okay, well, if you offer a tier that comes with a logo sticker that features like a bloody knife, then I'm in. I'll contribute at that tier.
Unfortunately, I don't have any additions of levels. It's just kind of make a donation because I don't have time to make T-shirts and all kinds of different stuff. Being a teacher, my life gets taken away a lot with that focus. But let's go back into where we were. We were talking about the actors, directors. Is there specific elements that you look for that makes it a slasher/horror film? Examples like characters, atmosphere. We mentioned some of them earlier, but give our listeners what you expect from a horror film or slasher film.
Well, when I'm watching a slasher, I love when the villain has a unique or a distinct look. And I especially love when part of that look is some kind of cool looking mask, There are some slasher movies out there where the guy's just kind of walking around in jeans and a t-shirt. The Slumber Party Massacre comes to mind. But I really don't care for that, even though that might be more realistic. If you think about the real world, that most people would probably just be jeans and a t-shirt if they were going to do something like this. But to me, I kind of like when the villain in the film has kind of a bit of an iconic, unique look. Something that you could think about dressing up as for Halloween.
There we go.
And then also I love when they have an effective musical score. I love when you've got a cast of actors and actresses and there's some good looking folks in that group. That's always entertaining. And then I like when there are unique ways that maybe the characters are dispatched in the course of the film. But I'm not really a gore hound, actually. It doesn't have to be super bloody or gory or over the top, but I certainly appreciate when a film comes up with maybe a unique way to dispatch a victim that I haven't seen before.
That's true. Is there a set of rules that people have to be able to, like directors need to follow in order to make it fit into that kind of genre?
I don't think so. The great thing about horror is it's really inclusive, and the limits of what can be a horror movie are extremely flexible. And so, no, I would say no rules whatsoever. Instead, it's more exciting to kind of see where the genre ends up organically going rather than trying to put rules upon it. And so, for example, like when you look back in 1996, horror was in a really low slump at that time. Right about the time that I was getting into horror on VHS and kind of checking out the 80s classics, new horror was in a slump. But then it got revolutionized December of 96 when Wes Craven's Scream got released. And this was like the first major movie that injected the meta quality into horror. That is, you referenced earlier, like the characters being dumb and stupid and not seeming to know how to live or survive, or not noticing that their friend's been missing for 4 hours.
Yeah.
These were finally characters who had heard of all the horror movies that I was actively watching at the time. They knew about Halloween. They knew about Friday the 13th, Prom Night. They knew about them all. They were all sitting on a video shelf waiting to be rented, and these characters had actually seen them, liked them, and learned from them. And they had noticed the same flaws of horror movies that anybody would notice. And Scream also had a sense of humor to it as well. And so after the success of Scream, other horror movies that came out over the next several years took some of those meta elements and those comedic elements and injected them into their films as well. And so there was a great multi-year period there where all these new slashers were coming out, and they were sort of inspired by Scream, which was really cool. And that's why I say, like, let's not put any rules on horror, because maybe in the next year or two, something revolutionary that's analogous to Scream will come out and will, you know, kind of change the game for the next several years for what horror is and what we get to experience.
And I want to apologize for the comment earlier saying for the dumb, not out there kind of knowing people, because that could be a very negative connotation there at times, but that's just kind of my little perspective there. So,
well, it's true. Like if this was a horror movie and we weren't a meta horror movie, but maybe we were an 80s horror movie, I would get up from the table and excuse myself in the middle of recording this podcast, go and get killed in your bathroom, and 4 hours later, you'd still be sitting here waiting for me to return.
This is true.
None the wiser that I'm hanging in the shower by my intestines.
I never heard you screaming or never heard anything of that sort.
Exactly.
You know?
Your bathroom's soundproofed.
It's true at that point. But again, just had to be able to apologize for those words, because I hate when someone throws that out in my classroom or throws it out there in nature. So now I feel a little better for that one. Now, since the Halloween series, and since all that kind of started, why do they do a lot of association with holidays like this in their films?
I think that it really has to do with both Black Christmas and with Halloween. The fact that you had two early slasher movies that came out and specifically set themselves around a real world holiday and use that holiday in the title of the film. And honestly, I think Hollywood producers are just superficial. They noticed something was successful and that it revolved around a holiday, and they just wanted to kind of jump on the train and see if they could replicate that. And so really most major holidays have a horror movie out there. You can find a horror movie for your birthday, Happy Birthday to Me. You can find one for New Year's called New Year's Evil. Numerous ones for Halloween, Christmas. It exists, most likely.
That's smart, because it's hitting in on that rush of time period where people are watching movies of, say, after Christmas, like, oh, let's go to the Chinese restaurant and then go watch a movie. And those horror film people are waiting for it. So that makes a lot of sense. Got to jump on where the money is. Now, how you mentioned in 1996 when Scream came into play and it changed the genre, how has it evolved like that in, say, 2000 plus? Because we are now, since 1996 to 2022, that's a 28-year change there. Or sorry, 26-year change there. Any thoughts?
Yeah, so horror has been through some other phases since that kind of meta comedic phase of the late 90s and early 2000s. Certainly in October of 2003, there was a remake released for the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and it was massively successful at the box office. That kind of began a new era of horror where the classics from the 70s, 80s were now being remade. And so you had remakes released over the next several years for When a Stranger Calls, Prom Night, Halloween, Friday the 13th, A Nightmare on Elm Street, The Amityville Horror. You name it, it was probably remade in that period. Again, going back to the idea that something came out and it was successful, it connected with the audience, it worked, and other people who make movies wanted a piece of that. Also, though, in 2004, there was a film released by director James Wan called Saw.
Yeah.
That was very successful as well. Low budget film that made massive amounts of money. And so not only did a new Saw movie get released annually for the next several years through 2010, but you had some other kind of more extreme types of horror movies released in the next several years as well. Things like the Hostel franchise come to mind. You know, things that were a little bit more realistic in their portrayal and really weren't afraid to show you this kind of extreme gore. And again, it wasn't being shown in like a funny kind of way like most 80s horror movies were. This was being shown in like a realistic, gross you out kind of way.
Yeah, I wasn't a big fan of those. I watched the first one. I was like, I can't handle this. I can't handle it.
One and done.
Yeah, in Final Destination, I couldn't handle that either. I remember going and seeing 3 in theaters, number 3, and I was like, too gory, too realistic. I feel like now anything I'm going to do is going to happen to me. I'm going to die, or I'm going to get trapped in some room and have to chop some guy's arm off just to get a key or something. So now let's move over from the general knowledge here that's been kind of passed down to your like personal likes and dislikes and things as well. So besides the slasher films, what are some other genres or types of horror films that you like to watch?
Well, I also love some kind of quirky horror comedies. Films like Beetlejuice and The Burbs, I think, are outstanding films as well. I do like some haunted house horror films, like the original Amityville Horror. Heck, actually, I even liked the 2005 remake with Ryan Reynolds. I also like some suspense and thriller movies, things like The Sixth Sense and The Silence of the Lambs, Jordan Peele's Get Out. Really, there's probably not a kind of horror that I don't have at least one movie that I like under that particular subgenre.
Is there a list of types of genres that maybe pop up underneath the horror realm?
I don't know if anyone's ever made a complete list because I think it's such a huge list.
Yeah, endless. With like rock and roll, you could go down so many subgenres.
Yeah, and there's even rock and roll horror movies, you know. There's a movie from the 80s called Trick or Treat that features small little roles played by Gene Simmons and Ozzy Osbourne. That's about a teenager who's a big fan of a rock star that dies and then starts communicating with that rock star once he's in the afterlife. So, yeah, the list of what can be a horror movie in my mind is huge. Like I said earlier, I think it's a big tent. And that's why I mentioned Beetlejuice. Somebody might hear that and say, Beetlejuice, a horror movie? Yeah, to me, that's a horror comedy and a fantastic film.
I could totally see that being labeled underneath that, because there's some scenes that are just like really just jump out to you, almost like that thriller kind of, but also has that, that humor, has that, the dark side that kind of comes into it. I agree with that for sure.
And before we move on, I would want to also mention sci-fi. Sci-fi is a common genre to have an overlap with horror as well. I'm thinking of Ridley Scott's Alien as a great example. I mean, that movie is about a space crew being hunted and haunted and tortured by an alien. And that is a horror movie. The Alien franchise went on to kind of abandon the horror roots with the sequels, but that original one is a horror movie in my opinion.
I agree with that. I remember seeing that, and I could totally see that association. I only saw like the first 2, and then after that, I kind of like faded away to it.
Well, you saw the best.
Now, there's a lot of franchises that you've mentioned. What is some of your favorites that you say that franchise sticks out, and I recommend as it goes on, maybe 1 through 3 or all of them, just kind of tickles my fancy?
Well, honestly, I like some of the ones that are the most popular ones. No surprise, I love the Halloween franchise. I love the Friday the 13th franchise. Again, those were like my 2 earliest franchises that I got into when I was getting into horror. But I also love the Scream franchise, A Nightmare on Elm Street. I love the Chucky movies. Yeah, those are some of my favorites.
Yeah, whenever you get into series, it just kind of goes on and on. Has there ever been a set that has just gone too long?
A franchise that went too far. Maybe the Hellraiser franchise has gone a little too far. The first 4 movies in the series were theatrically released films, and then starting with number 5, they went direct to video. And honestly, in the modern day era with like streaming services and film skipping theater, direct to video is not a death curse, like there can be some good stuff that just comes straight to home video or straight to streaming, but not necessarily back in the 90s. It was a different era to skip a theater at that time. And so most of the Hellraiser sequels are actually screenplays that were written without Pinhead in them. And then they just simply went back and tacked in 1 or 2 scenes with Pinhead and branded it a Hellraiser movie, and that was it. So they weren't really made with a lot of care or love. And the cool thing is Pinhead in those first 8 Hellraiser movies was played by Doug Bradley, and at least he lends some legitimacy to the movies. But unfortunately, a lot of times he was stuck playing Pinhead in movies that just really weren't all that good.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm going to use the word money grab sometimes.
Totally.
That becomes a common thing for some movies. And you're like, you should have stopped 4 ago. Why do you keep going?
And I'm also not sure that Leatherface has been treated properly either. I think there's been too much exploitation of that character. Like when you think about the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre and the original Hellraiser are 2 fantastic movies, and they deserved better sequels and better franchise runs than they've received based on where they began.
I agree. That goes on a lot of the times. It's kind of like the first album for a lot of bands that they've been writing it for years. They've been building it up for years, and they finally release the album, and it's great. And that second album, it feels like rushed. Like
the sophomore slump, right?
Yeah, exactly. Very common thing. Now, do you have a favorite director?
My favorite director is M. Night Shyamalan. I love M. Night. I was about 10 years old when The Sixth Sense came out, and he kind of, blew up and became a household name. And so I've been a fan of his for over 20 years now, ever since. And again, he's not ever made what might be explicitly labeled as a horror movie, but he has done thrillers and suspense, which falls under that horror umbrella. And he's taken and utilized horror elements when appropriate. Watch The Sixth Sense for the first time, and you're definitely going to jump or be unsettled before that movie ends.
Oh, yeah.
And he's also used some of those same elements in Signs, which is a fantastic movie, in Split. And then he's even currently got a streaming series that is about to debut its final season called Servant that's got a lot of dark and scary elements intermixed in it as well.
Yeah, that's pretty neat to think on how someone's career can just one film can change their entire lives to be able to kind of go on and one film to the next film. They get that gold standard stamp on them that anything they touch is going to become the next big box office hit for a little while.
Yeah, well, I think M. Night might have ruined that a little once he put out The Happening. But yeah, I know what you mean.
Michael Bay did the same thing with it, just continued and continued. And now, like, okay, I expect the same thing from every Michael Bay film. There's going to be massive explosions that make no sense, and it just goes on, and the story writing is too quick, and I don't know.
And the building's going to become a bumblebee.
Yep, exactly. The building will come bumblebee. Now, do you have a favorite kill from the horror films?
Oh, wow. There's just so many, right?
I mean, yeah, it's endless.
And especially someone like me who constantly watches and streams horror movies, and I'm also always seeking out a new horror movie. I'm always looking for something I haven't seen.
Yeah.
But I don't know if I have an absolute just number one favorite above all else, but when I think about a kill that's really pretty cool, I'm thinking about Friday the 13th Part 7, The New Blood. And in the film, there's a moment where Jason is approaching a victim. She's in this yellow sleeping bag, and of course she thinks she can protect herself from Jason by simply pulling the covers of the sleeping bag over her face.
Can't
right?
step through that. Yeah, exactly.
Some of those smart characters we were discussing earlier, right?
Yeah.
Fortunately for us in the audience, Jason is able to overcome the foil that she's trying to put forth, and so he just grabs the sleeping bag, pulls the sleeping bag up with her inside, and bangs it against the side of a tree. One bang, and she's dead.
Dang. Yeah, that's pretty well hit it.
And that's a pretty cool one.
Yeah. Since mentioned Jason here, how did you feel about that Jason Freddy crossover battle?
I loved it.
Loved it.
I thought it was amazing. That came out the first week we were in high school.
Oh, it did?
Yeah. So it came out August of 2004. I'm sorry. It came out August of 2003.
Yeah, that would be right.
And we had just started on the Monday, and that Friday is when Freddy vs. Jason came out. I don't remember if my mom checked me out early or if she just picked me up on the sidewalk of the school immediately at 3:15 when the school day had ended. But I know the first thing I did after class on that Friday was go to theaters and see Freddy vs. Jason. And I thought it was absolutely amazing. I think it's such a fun, really good time in that movie.
And with the ironicness of going to the movie theater, rushing right after school. You worked at the movie theater for a long time, and sometimes you would leave straight from school and go work to the movie theater.
Yes, fortunately, this time I wasn't clocking in.
This is true.
Although maybe clocking in and then watching a movie on the clock would have been fun.
And I remember a lot of the times, thank you and a couple other people, I didn't have to pay for a lot of movies sometimes. You would trade off favors for one to another.
Well, at this time, this was, of course, being little freshies. We were too young to have jobs yet, so I didn't know that I was going to become a theater employee at that time.
How hindsight 2020 here. It always comes out that way. Now, what is the worst horror film that you've ever seen?
There's so many bad ones, to be honest. The way that you can find the bad ones is get on your smart TV and download one of those streaming services that costs no money. I'm not talking like maybe one of the more major ones like Pluto or Tubi, but go and look for those ones that are called like F Awesome. I don't know, or is it Fossum? I don't know.
I don't know.
Somebody
There's
tweet
too
us and
many
tell
out
us
there.
But download one of those and see all the stuff that they're willing to let you watch for free, and you've never heard of it. It has like a $20 budget. It's awful if you try to start watching any of it. But in terms of giving you a specific title, last year we mentioned how the holidays get exploited for horror movies, right?
Yes.
And so, again, there's major horror movies out there for Valentine's Day and for St. Patrick's Day and Halloween and Christmas, but there's really not a major horror movie for Thanksgiving, surprisingly. So I took to Google and I thought, well, gosh, somebody has to have made a Thanksgiving-themed horror movie. And I found one called Thanksgilling. Okay.
Love the title. Yeah.
Cute title, right? It's about a killer talking turkey.
A killer talking turkey.
And I think I was trying to watch the movie alone and sober, and I just didn't have the right environment in place to enjoy this particular movie. Maybe if you were watching it with friends and had some beverages fixed and
Get a good laugh.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe it'd be like a good cult fun friend kind of time where you just laugh and cut up and enjoy the absurdity of the premise. But alone, drinking water with the sun shining through the window, it just didn't work. And I ended up, I don't even know if I made it about 25 minutes in before I just couldn't take it anymore.
Speaking of like holiday films, there was, I can't remember how many years ago it was, but I sat down and was like, oh, look, Robin Williams has this film I've never seen. That's a Christmas film. I remember sitting down and watching and be like, this is the worst thing ever, but I need to make it to the very end because maybe there's some humor in here. But Robin Williams was not funny in that film at all. And I was like, this is rough. This is rough. But I don't know if this is considered a horror film or not, but I loved 1 Hour Photo.
Oh, I love that. Yeah.
Like,
yeah, you probably put that under something kind of psychological, right? Psychological horror.
For sure, psychological.
Yeah.
Now,
fantastic movie.
You mentioned on that you made it 25 minutes. What are some other elements that is going to make you stop watching that film? And you're like, nope, done.
Well, just looking cheap. I mean, of course, low budget's not the worst thing in the world. Halloween was made for $325,000, but again, looking cheap. People in the film that just really cannot act, that were probably
picked up on the street.
Yeah, or the director's best friends, right? Like, hey, let's make a movie this weekend when everyone's got the day off, kind of thing. Yeah, those are just some of the like major things. When I try to stream some of those free horror movies that I'm talking about, a lot of times those are just some of the worst elements that are immediately apparent. Is that this film had no budget and these people are not in any way, shape, or form professional or amateur actors.
You gotta love when that kind of pops up. Sometimes you need the good laugh, or sometimes you need the good oddity. I remember picking out, I can't remember if it was on, I think it was Netflix, of Hobo with a Shotgun. Because I'm like, the title sounded great. I can't remember the famous guy's name that was in it that does all these, he's always the weird bad guy in all the films, but it was like, hey, I like that guy's actor's name. Probably a lot of people are like, oh no, the guy's name. I don't remember the guy's name right now. Famous actor. Now, what is a concept that you were thinking about, this would be a good concept for a horror film that hasn't happened yet?
Well, I own too much crap, so I have a storage room. And the storage room I have is climate controlled, so it's inside the building. So I go inside the building and I turn down one kind of short hallway, and then I turn down a much longer hallway to get to my particular storage unit. And I've been in that storage unit or storage facility before, and I've thought to myself, what would I do if I stepped out of my room, put the protective door down, go to lock it, and I turned, and at the end of the hallway, someone was just randomly standing there staring at me? What would I do?
Ooh.
And especially if they were doing nothing but just breathing and wearing some kind of mask or something to conceal their face, And so it struck me that a storage facility like that, kind of an indoor one that just has hallways and whatever, that confined nature would lend itself pretty well for a horror movie, I think. Either for the duration, if the person's creative enough, or at least for maybe one character to get killed in a storage facility. There's inherently something claustrophobic when you get into environments that, have those kind of hallways and there's maybe only one or two ways in or out. And that claustrophobia works great in a horror movie.
And it's like a maze too. Sometimes I get lost all the time in those things.
Exactly. Like, if the person's blocking the normal way that you come and go, so you run the way you're less familiar with, you may end up turning down a hallway and not finding the other exit, but instead finding a new collection of storage rooms, right? So now you've got to navigate your way out of this facility.
You've got a blank check now. We have the concept here. You got a blank check. You have the ability to hire anybody, including bringing in somebody from the dead. We're going to add in that special element there. And you can bring in any director. You could have any feud kind of going on is now settled. Like actors hate each other. They're now settled. What would be the cast? Who would be the director? Who are going to be your actors? Again, with this blank check. Because we have the background here in a storage unit facility.
Well, honestly, if I had a blank check, I would do a different idea.
Okay, then go with that one. We're going to add in that.
Yeah, the storage facility, that's like my Kevin Smith Clerks. I'd probably make it for like $25,000. I know, I'm going to see it. Yeah, I'm excited. Clerks 3, right?
Yep, Clerks 3. So, okay, then go with give us a whole fresh scene here.
But with this big budget horror movie, I'll tell you what I'd love to do. There's this great little horror comedy that's family appropriate from the late 80s called The Monster Squad. Have you seen it?
I have not.
Okay, so the idea behind it is there's this group of kids and they all love horror movies, but for them, what they love is like the universal classics. They love The Wolfman and Dracula and Frankenstein's monster and The Gill Man. That's what they love. And at a certain point in the movie, those universal classic monsters come out of the celluloid into the real world. And so now this group of kids has got to fight these universal monsters that they grew up on and loved. I think it would be wonderful if we could get like a Monster Squad, I don't know, sequel, reboot, whatever you wanted to call it, where the group of characters now were fans of the characters that I grew up loving.
Ooh.
So like Freddy, Jason, Michael, Leatherface, Ghostface, the fisherman from I Know What You Did Last Summer, Chucky, Pinhead. All of them, let them be fans of them, and then something goes wrong, and these classic slasher characters come out of the film world into our real world, and the kids have to fight against them.
So I
think that would be a lot of fun.
That would be very interesting. Who are going to be some of the actors?
Well, I'd want everyone who's like most notoriously known for each character to be the one to play it. So I'd love it if Robert Englund was back playing Freddy, Doug Bradley was back playing Pinhead, if you have to have Brad Dourif doing the voice of Chucky. All of those classic actors, Kane Hodder back playing Jason. Everyone who sort of is known as the definitive version of each slasher villain. That's who I'd want to come back and to play the characters again in our Monster Squad reboot.
Do we have any kids that we're going to cast in? The cast of Stranger Things. This is the new season of Stranger Things.
So you know what? As a horror person, people are so shocked when I tell them I've never watched Stranger Things.
That's okay. I know a lot of people that haven't. I enjoy it. I watched the new season. I'm looking forward to it. I'm curious to see how they're going to end it. But, it's not for everyone. That's true. But who are the kids? Modern day, or you can bring back kids. From the dead. You can change people from certain ages.
Oh, okay.
You have a time machine.
So I can have like Kyle Richards as her age that she was in the original Halloween, right?
Yep, you can do that.
Where she's the little girl. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Hey, Corey Feldman, right? I mean, if you're going to have like people back as kids, you got to have Corey Feldman.
That works.
He was a classic kid actor. And who else? Oh, what the heck? Let's get Macaulay Culkin in there.
I was going to guess that. Yes. Yes, Macaulay Culkin. Love it. I was hoping that would be one.
Why not? Like every like classic kid actor, Danielle Harris at her like Halloween 4 age when she was 10, 11 years old. Let's get her back. Let's just have them all be like this mixed gender, mixed ethnicity group of friends. And they all have the common love of horror.
That's funny. I love it. Funny story. I actually got served pizza by Macaulay Culkin at the Pizza Underground show. Like he was handing out pizza and my brother and I were standing front row, and so he was handing out boxes of pizza, but we were the guy that was taking the pizza.
Wow.
Yeah.
I thought to myself recently, I rewatched A Nightmare on Elm Street a couple of months ago, the original one, Wes Craven's, and towards the end of the movie, the lead protagonist, Nancy, booby traps her house. So she's planning to go to sleep, grab a hold of Freddie, have her alarm go off, and because she's going to wake up having hugged Freddie, that basically he's getting transferred into the real world when she wakes up. That's her strategy. And when he gets into the real world, then she's going to have her home all booby trapped with like a sledgehammer that's going to come down when he opens the door and all this. And when I watch it, I can't help but feel like Home Alone took a little inspiration from this booby trap sequence.
I would have never thought about that at all. That's amazing.
And I don't know for sure that that's the case, but I watch it and I'm like, this is a little bit like Home Alone, except Nightmare on Elm Street came first. So
that does take it down. That does make that change there. Now let's move to the Mount Rushmore. Who is your 4 people on the Mount Rushmore of horror genre?
In terms of like slashers themselves?
They could be anything under the giant tent. Or you can do specifically slashers, your choice.
Yeah, I mean, I'm such a huge fan of the big 3, Freddy, Jason, and Michael. And so then it becomes hard to say, gosh, who's going to be number 4? Because I also love Ghostface from the Scream franchise, but I also love Chucky. I think one of those 2 is definitely like the number 4. Yeah, so I would say some collection of those 5. Maybe they can duke it out in the ring like celebrity deathmatch style. And
I'll allow it.
And whomever survives that battle, those are the 4 that can make it onto the Mount Kilmore.
I need to go back and watch that. That was when MTV was doing some very interesting stuff, like Daria. That was another good one. Clone High was a great one. I need to go back and see some of those ones again. Celebrity Deathmatch was awesome.
It was. I think it's on some streaming service.
It's got to be.
But, they're not sponsoring us, so we're not going to mention which one it is.
This is true. At this point, you can reach out and we'll gladly, add in a sponsorship there. We won't do a full commercial, but we'll give you a shout out. Where would you put the Mount Rushmore?
Oh, you mean like geographically?
Yeah, where would you geographically place it?
Where would it be located? I would say my backyard, but I wouldn't want tourists coming and seeing it, right?
True statement. There you go.
So, maybe like, I don't know, Death Valley or Transylvania, right? Like it's got to be something that's already got like a little bit of that horror hook to it.
I agree with that. That'd be kind of cool. That'd be very neat. Now, you've actually visited a couple different locations of horror films places. Where have you gone?
Well, a couple of months ago, I was really excited to go and visit the campground here in the great state of Georgia that was the filming location for Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives. And so not only was I there and got to tour the premises and see the cabins, several of which are in the film, but then we also took a ride down the road to the local cemetery that's also in the film. So in Jason Lives, the movie begins, Jason's dead and buried, and he has a tombstone. So the location that they filmed that cemetery at is also here in Georgia, so I got to go and visit that location as well. So that was really cool. Then I was randomly watching a brand new horror movie with Kevin Bacon that's called They/Them. And I'm watching it, and it takes place at a campground, and I'm sitting there, and I was like, oh my God, this is the same campground that Jason Lives was filmed at that I just visited. How cool is that? So had no idea when I was there that it had been the filming site for more than one horror movie.
Yeah, I remember going to the steps in DC right outside. What movie was that? Was that Psycho? Not Psycho.
Is that The Exorcist?
Yes, The Exorcist steps.
Didn't you text that to me?
I did. I took a picture of that. That was really creepy. That was awesome.
Yeah.
That's the only one that I can like name off the top of my head that I've been to kind of visit and see. So neat little spot there. Now we have a new person that's never seen horror films, kind of like whenever you were your uncle introduced to it. What would be a new or old film that you would recommend them to watch to get them interested?
I think I would have to get an idea maybe of what their style is. Sometimes you talk to people and they say, oh, I can't watch horror, it's too scary, right? And so then I might want to go for something that's more on the thriller side, like The Silence of the Lambs might be a good place for someone who doesn't just want to risk being out and out scared. Not to say that they may not still be scared, but you know what I mean? Like you might want to go for something that's got a little more drama to it, a little more story to it. But if it's someone who's like, nope, blank slate, I'm open, I say start exactly where I started. Start with John Carpenter's Halloween and see what you think.
Good start. I like that. Go into the 80s, work your way back. Was that 80s or 79?
That was 78.
Man, I was off.
Almost
there. Yeah, going to that's a.
There's an 8 in the number.
There is an 8. So I get like a 40% on that test, maybe in somewhere in that range. Now we're gonna start winding down here on the episode. Is there any last minute things that perhaps I didn't discuss or that you would kind of like to share with the audience?
I think what I would want to share, especially if someone's listening who's like, oh my gosh, I can't stand horror, is a lot of times there may be more to the genre than you think. It's not exclusively about blood and guts and trying to scare you, but oftentimes horror deals with way more than that. And so I'm thinking of things like Jordan Peele's Get Out dealing with racism, or there was a remake a couple of years ago of The Invisible Man that deals with domestic violence. And so oftentimes there may be more going on in the horror genre than you're aware of if you're an outsider looking in. The other thing I'd point out too is that there's a really good chance if you have an actor or actress that you're a big fan of, there's a really good chance they've been in at least one horror movie or television episode or project or something. So many famous big names have been involved in horror in some capacity in their careers. And not only like royalty like Jamie Lee Curtis that we've already mentioned, but other folks like Johnny Depp, Brad Pitt, Kevin Bacon, and even people like Tom Hanks has been on an episode of Tales from the Crypt, or Daniel Craig, who just finished a 15-year reign as James Bond, right? Like he was in a Tales from the Crypt episode early in his career as well. So there's a really good chance someone that you like and are a fan of has been involved in horror as well. So you might be surprised when you find that on their filmography.
I like that. I never would have thought that. That's some great to throw out there that I didn't even think about even asking. So thank you for bringing that in. Is there a statement or a word of advice that you would just like to give somebody out in the world kind of as we're coming in these troubling times?
Honestly, I thought your introductory quote was pretty perfect. And I loved the part about you are enough, you have enough, you do enough. It kind of reminded me recently, there was an interview with Jim Carrey, whom I love. And he was kind of saying that he might be retiring now that Sonic the Hedgehog 2 has come and gone. And he said something similar where he's like, you know what, I've done enough. I have enough money. I've achieved enough in my career. I am enough, and I'm just going to try to be happy with what I have. And so I think that's a real positive message, just kind of learning that we have enough. And it doesn't mean that you can't still aspire for some improvement, but not to the detriment of your own health and well-being, right?
Like that. Great little addition on that quote. And I'm going to have to go and watch that Jim Carrey quotes and stuff now because I haven't seen that or heard of that yet. And I'd be kind of sad seeing Jim Carrey go, but his catalog is just endless. So that's cool. Thank you, Dakota, for coming on this podcast. It's been a pleasure to sit down with you for this hour worth of time. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Now, as we go to exit out of this episode, if you have any questions that you would like to reach out and ask me to relay over to Dakota, send me an email. It's at cade, which is spelled CADE, at learningfromfriends.com, and I'll reach out to him and get an answer to or a quote to kind of be able to send back to you. I am on Facebook, search Learning from Friends. I'm on Twitter, same idea. The Patreon I mentioned a little earlier, if you want to make a contribution to be able to continue this, because we all have bills we got to pay. We all have things to make this kind of working. I'll take $1 or $2. I'll take 25 cents if that works too, because I'm a teacher. I go through, I do my stuff. This is my off time that I enjoy as like a hobby that is kind of out there. And as we kind of go out today, I want to also thank Ryan Cherry for doing our intro and outro. And there will be a new one that pops up for season 2, which this is the end of season 1. So congratulations if you've listened all the way through this point. We're going to start in tomorrow, because if tomorrow's November 1st, the 1-year anniversary of Learning from Friends. So you were able to get kind of a double dose back-to-back day of listening. So as you listeners all know, when I come to the end of an episode, I like to go with, my name is Cade Curtis, your tour guide for Learning from Friends. And most of all, as you leave today, don't forget to let your curiosity fly high.